I work in a cafe that I inherited from my grandmother. This cafe has strange rules that you have to follow. The Lantern Cafe sat at the edge of the Everglade Woods, its glowing lanterns lining the pathway like breadcrumbs leading to a storybook sanctuary. From the outside, it was a rustic cabin with ivy crawling up its weathered wood, a place that felt both timeless and deeply rooted in the present. Inside, it was an eclectic mix of cozy nostalgia, mismatched chairs, wooden tables with faint scratches from decades of use, and bookshelves overflowing with dog-eared novels and peculiar trinkets. My name is Ellie, and for the last 3 years, this cafe has been my whole world. I never planned it that way. This was supposed to be Nana's legacy, not mine. But life has a way of rearranging your plans when you least expect it. Nana loved this place. She used to say it was alive in its own way, as if the walls could breathe and the hearth could listen. Growing up, I spent my summers here, watching her move through the space like she was part of it, her hands quick and practiced as she brewed tea, her laughter soft and warm as it mingled with the scent of lavender and chamomile. She called it her little haven, a place where time slowed just enough for people to feel human again. It was hers until it wasn't. A stroke took her 3 years ago, sudden and silent, like a thief in the night. One moment she was here, and the next, she was gone. At the time, I was finishing my degree in culinary arts, dreaming of opening a modern bistro in Seattle or San Francisco. Taking over Nana's cafe wasn't in the plan. But after the funeral, I came back to sort through her things, and somehow, I never left. The cafe isn't bustling, and it never has been. It's more of a waypoint than a destination, a quiet retreat for hikers, birdwatchers, and the occasional curious traveler. Most customers stay just long enough to finish their tea or pastry, then continue on their way. That's fine by me. I like the quiet. It gives me time to think, though sometimes I think too much. I live upstairs in the attic. It's a snug space with slanted ceilings and a small window that overlooks the woods. Most nights, after locking up, I curl up with one of Nana's old books or watch the stars through that little window. It's not the life I dreamed of, but it's a life. And in its own way, it suits me. The Lantern Cafe has another side to it, one that even most regulars don't know about. It isn't something I advertise, not in the tourist brochures or on the hand-painted sign outside. It's a secret I stumbled upon when Nana passed, one she'd mentioned only in passing during my childhood but never explained. At first, I thought it was a family myth, a whimsical story meant to charm a curious kid. But it's real. I know that now. If you brew a cup of chamomile tea, not just any tea, but a very particular kind, you can speak to someone who has passed on. There are rules, though, and they're not negotiable. The tea must be brewed with boiling water, and a teaspoon of sugar must be stirred in, no more, no less. The conversation only lasts until the final sugar crystal dissolves. And most importantly, you cannot touch the spirit, and you must never turn your back on them. If you break the rules, the consequences are not something I've dared to imagine. I didn't create this ritual, and neither did Nana. She told me it had been a part of the cafe for as long as she could remember, passed down with the building itself. The teacups used for the ritual are old, older than the cafe, older than my family's history here. The patterns on their surfaces are faded, the porcelain worn thin, but they hum faintly in your hands, like they're alive. I've never used the tea myself. I've thought about it, of course. The temptation is always there. But every time I find myself holding the delicate teacup, wondering if I should see Nana again, I stop. She warned me once, in her own gentle way, that the tea isn't meant for indulgence. It's for closure, she said. Not for clinging. Still, I've seen enough to know how powerful it is. I've watched the magic unfold in the quiet, firelit corner of the cafe where visitors sit, their hands trembling as they hold the warm cup and wait. The air seems to shift when it happens, a subtle change, like the world pauses to listen. And then, they're there. The lost ones. Looking as real as the day they left. Every time it happens, I feel both awed and uneasy. There's beauty in it, yes, but also a heaviness I can't shake. The first time I witnessed it was a month after taking over the cafe. A woman, probably in her 60s, came in with a quiet sort of determination. She ordered chamomile tea and added, almost as an afterthought, with sugar, please. 1 teaspoon. I didn't think anything of it until she carried the tea to the far corner and sat there, waiting. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted the cup, her lips moving in what looked like a prayer. Then the room changed. It's hard to describe, but the air felt heavier, almost electric. And suddenly, there was a man sitting across from her, his features soft with recognition. Her husband, I guessed. She spoke to him in a voice too low for me to hear, but her tears were unmistakable. When the tea cooled, the man faded like a morning mist, and the woman sat there for a long time, staring into her empty cup. When she finally left, she stopped by the counter. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the tears still glistening on her cheeks. "This place, it's special. You take good care of it." I didn't ask her what she meant. I didn't need to. The cafe's secret was no longer a myth to me, it was a responsibility. One I wasn't sure I wanted, but one I couldn't ignore. It was a gray, drizzly afternoon when he came in. I was behind the counter, wiping down the same spot I'd already wiped 3 times, when the bell above the door jingled. A man stepped inside, his hair damp and his jacket soaked through. He hesitated for a moment, glancing around the cafe like he wasn't sure he should be there. Then his eyes landed on me. "Chamomile tea," he said, his voice low. "With sugar. 1 teaspoon. I nodded, hiding my surprise. Most people ordered chamomile tea without understanding its significance. This man, though, he knew exactly what he was asking for. His hands trembled as he dug into his pocket, pulling out a damp $10 bill and sliding it across the counter. "Take a seat," I said, gesturing toward the corner booth near the fireplace. "I'll bring it to you." He nodded, his gaze darting to the window before he shuffled over to the booth. He sat stiffly, his hands folded on the table, staring at the empty space across from him. There was something about his posture, rigid, yet weary, that told me he carried a heavy burden. I brewed the tea carefully, watching the sugar dissolve as I stirred. When it was ready, I placed the delicate porcelain cup on a tray and carried it over. He didn't look up as I set it in front of him. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I stepped back, giving him space. He wrapped his hands around the cup, staring into the steaming liquid like it held all the answers he'd been searching for. The air in the cafe grew heavier, the hum of the world outside fading into silence. And then, the shift happened. A woman appeared across from him. Her hair was dark and fell in soft waves around her face. She wore a simple dress, the kind you'd see in old photographs. She smiled at him, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "Clara," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Alex," she said, her tone gentle. "It's been so long." They spoke in hushed tones, their words too quiet for me to hear. But the emotion on his face was unmistakable, grief, longing, and a deep, aching guilt. Tears welled in his eyes as he leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table like he was afraid to let go. "I'm so sorry," I heard him say, his voice breaking. "I should have stopped you. I should have been there. But I froze. I let you step onto that road, and..." Her expression softened, and she reached out, stopping just short of his hand. "Alex, it wasn't your fault," she said. "You couldn't have known. You couldn't have saved me." He shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I should have tried harder. I should have done something." They continued speaking, their voices rising and falling like waves. The conversation grew quieter as the tea cooled, and I knew their time was running out. When the last sugar crystal dissolved, Clara's form began to fade. Alex reached out instinctively, but he stopped himself, his hand trembling in midair. "Goodbye, Alex," she said softly, her voice lingering even after her image disappeared. He sat there for a long time, staring at the empty seat across from him. When he finally stood, his shoulders sagged with the weight of his confession. He approached the counter, his expression hollow but strangely lighter. "Thank you," he said, his voice raw. "This place, it gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have again." I nodded, unsure of what to say. He left without another word, the bell above the door jingling softly as he stepped into the rain. I watched him go, the image of Clara's sad smile still vivid in my mind. The cafe was quiet again, but the air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of his sorrow. It was just after noon on a sunny Saturday when the next visitor arrived. The sunlight streamed through the cafe windows, catching the dust motes in the air. I was reorganizing the stack of books on the counter when the bell above the door chimed. A boy stepped inside, looking around nervously. He couldn't have been older than 16, his lanky frame almost swallowed by the oversized hoodie he wore. A worn backpack hung off one shoulder, and his sneakers squeaked slightly on the wooden floor as he shuffled toward the counter. His face was pale, his eyes darting around the room like he expected someone to tell him he didn't belong here. Hi," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Can I get chamomile tea? With sugar. 1 teaspoon. I paused for a moment, studying him. He avoided my gaze, his hands fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. He knew. Somehow, this boy knew the cafe's secret. "Of course," I said, keeping my tone light. "Take a seat wherever you like. I'll bring it to you." He nodded quickly and chose the smallest table, tucked near the bookshelf at the back of the room. I prepared the tea with care, stirring in the sugar until the crystals dissolved just enough to leave a faint shimmer on the surface. As I approached with the tray, I noticed his hands tapping nervously on the table. "Here you go," I said, setting the cup in front of him. He mumbled a quick thanks and wrapped his hands around the mug, staring into it as though it might give him courage. I stepped back, giving him space but staying close enough to intervene if needed. The shift came, as it always did. The sunlight in the room seemed to dim, and the air grew still. Across from the boy, a figure appeared. It was an older man, perhaps in his 70s, with a kind face and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He wore a flannel shirt and a weathered baseball cap that looked like it had seen decades of fishing trips. "Hey there, kiddo," the man said, his voice warm and steady. The boy's lips trembled, his words sticking in his throat. Finally, he managed to whisper, "Grandpa." "Yeah, it's me," the man replied, leaning forward slightly. "You're taller than I remember. Look at you." The boy blinked rapidly, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I miss you so much," he said, his voice cracking. It's been so hard without you." The grandfather smiled gently. "I know, kid. But you're doing okay. Better than you think." Their conversation flowed quietly, a mixture of laughter, tears, and the kind of wisdom that only comes from someone who's lived a full life. The boy talked about school, his mom, and the pressure he felt to make decisions about his future. The grandfather listened intently, nodding and offering advice that seemed to settle the boy's nerves. "Life's not about knowing all the answers right away," the grandfather said at one point. "It's about figuring it out as you go. And trust me, you're gonna figure it out just fine." The boy smiled through his tears, his shoulders relaxing for the first time since he'd walked in. But the tea was cooling, and the shimmer of the sugar was fading. "I don't want you to go," the boy said, his voice small. "I'll always be with you, kiddo," the grandfather said, his smile soft and full of love. "Even if you can't see me." As the last crystal dissolved, the older man's form began to fade. The boy reached out instinctively but stopped himself, his hand hovering in the air as his grandfather disappeared. The room brightened again, the sunlight streaming through the windows as if nothing had happened. The boy sat there for a moment, staring at the empty chair across from him. Then he wiped his face on his sleeve, stood up, and approached the counter. "Thank you," he said, his voice shaky but sincere. I needed that." "You're welcome," I said softly. "Take care of yourself." He nodded and walked out, his backpack bouncing slightly with each step. I watched him disappear down the path, a bittersweet feeling settling over me. The cafe was quiet again, but his words lingered in the air. It was moments like this that reminded me why the cafe's secret existed, even if I didn't fully understand it myself. The day was overcast, the kind of dull gray afternoon that felt like the world was holding its breath. I was tidying up the counter, counting down the hours until closing, when the cafe door slammed open with a force that made the bell jangle wildly. A man stumbled inside, his breathing ragged, his hair disheveled. His shirt was torn, streaked with dirt and something darker. "Tea," he gasped, his voice hoarse. "Chamomile tea. 1 teaspoon of sugar." I froze for a moment, taking in the wild look in his eyes. He was shaking, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Something about him felt unstable, like a taut wire ready to snap. Still, I nodded and moved toward the teapot, my movements deliberate. "Take a seat," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'll bring it to you." He collapsed into the corner booth, his body sagging as though the weight of the world was pressing down on him. His fingers drummed erratically on the table, and he muttered under his breath, words I couldn't quite catch. As I prepared the tea, I couldn't shake the sense of unease. There was a desperation in him that I'd seen before, but never quite like this. When I brought the cup to his table, he grabbed it with both hands, his knuckles white. "Thank you," he said, though his voice was barely audible. He stared into the steaming liquid, his lips moving silently. I stepped back, giving him space while keeping him in my peripheral vision. The shift came quickly this time. The air grew thick, pressing against my skin, and the faint hum of the world outside seemed to vanish. Across from the man, a figure appeared. It was another man, close in age, with sharp features and a bruised cheek. His expression was a mix of confusion and anger. "What the hell, Drew?" the spirit said, his voice sharp. "What did you do?" "I'm sorry," the man, Drew, whispered, his voice cracking. He clutched the cup as though it were an anchor. "It was an accident. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to." "You killed me," the spirit interrupted, leaning forward. "You shoved me, and I fell. Do you know what that did to my family? To everyone who loved me?" "I didn't mean to." Drew's voice rose, desperate and raw. "We were arguing, and it got out of hand. I tried to stop you from leaving, but you tripped. It was an accident." The spirit's eyes narrowed, his form growing darker, more defined. "You didn't try hard enough," he said coldly. Drew's hands trembled, and before I could shout a warning, he reached out instinctively, brushing his fingers against the spirit's hand. The reaction was immediate. The spirit's form twisted, its edges turning jagged and sharp. Its eyes burned red, and the air in the cafe grew icy. "No," I whispered, stepping forward, but it was too late. The spirit didn't move. It simply stared at Drew, its gaze unrelenting. Drew gasped, clutching at his throat as if invisible hands were strangling him. His body convulsed, his face turning red, then purple. The only sound was his choked gasps and the faint hum of the spirit's presence. I stood frozen, powerless, as Drew collapsed onto the table. His body went still, and the spirit turned its gaze toward me. For one terrifying moment, I thought it might come for me too. But then it faded, vanishing into the heavy silence that filled the room. The cafe was deathly quiet. I stared at Drew's lifeless body, my mind racing. The teacup had tipped over, its contents spilling across the table and dripping onto the floor. My hand shook as I reached for the phone, dialing 911. The next few days passed in a blur of flashing lights, questioning detectives, and hushed whispers. The police ruled it a suicide, a troubled man overwhelmed by guilt. They didn't ask about the tea, or the way the air in the cafe had felt like a living thing. But I couldn't forget. The memory of Drew's final moments played on a loop in my mind, the sight of his convulsing body etched into my thoughts. I barely slept, barely ate. The cafe felt darker, heavier, as though the walls themselves mourned what had happened. Finally, unable to bear the weight of it any longer, I brewed a cup of chamomile tea. My hands shook as I stirred in the sugar, and I carried the cup to the corner booth. I sat down, staring into the steaming liquid, and whispered, "Nana, I need you." The air shifted, and she appeared. She looked just as I remembered, her kind eyes, her soft smile, her favorite apron tied neatly around her waist. "Oh, Ellie," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "I was wondering when you'd call." Nana stood there, just as real and warm as I remembered, her presence filling the corner booth like a comforting hug. But there was a heaviness in her expression, a weight that pulled at the corners of her kind smile. I didn't know whether to cry or speak, so I just stared at her, gripping the edge of the table. "Nana," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. "What is happening to me? To this place?" She sighed, her hands hovering over the table as if she wanted to reach out but couldn't. "Ellie, you've done well keeping the cafe running. But I need you to understand, it's not just a place for tea and pastries. It's a doorway, a bridge. And bridges come with tolls." "Tolls?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Drew is dead. I saw it happen. He touched the spirit in." Her eyes darkened, and she shook her head. "The rules are there for a reason. They've been the same for as long as this cafe has existed. The magic doesn't forgive mistakes." "Then why keep it open?" I demanded, the words spilling out in a rush. "Why did you leave this to me? Why not let it die with you?" Her gaze softened, but there was no escaping the sorrow behind it. "Because it doesn't work that way, Ellie. The magic is tied to us, our family. When I passed, it found you. And when your time comes, it will find the next keeper." My chest tightened, the weight of her words sinking in. "So I'm stuck here? Forever?" She hesitated before answering. "As long as the cafe stands, you must tend to it. If you abandon it, the spirits who have crossed over will lose their peace. They will wander, restless and vengeful, and they will find you." The room seemed to close in around me, the implications suffocating. "So I have no choice?" Nana leaned forward, her expression gentle but firm. "You have a choice, Ellie. You can choose to see this as a burden, or you can choose to see it as a responsibility. It's not easy, I know. I struggled with it too. But it's what keeps the balance." Tears stung my eyes, and I shook my head. I didn't ask for this. I wanted my own life, my own dreams. Her smile was bittersweet. "I know, sweetheart. And I'm so sorry. If there had been another way, I would have taken it. But this cafe needs you now. It always needs someone who understands its magic." I sat back, my hands shaking as I wiped at my face. "How do I do this, Nana? How do I keep going?" She reached out as if to touch my hand but stopped short, her fingers hovering just above mine. "One day at a time, Ellie. And remember, you're not alone. I'm here, in spirit. And the cafe itself, it's more alive than you know." Her form began to fade, the edges of her figure softening like a photograph left out in the sun. "Nana, wait," I said, panic rising in my chest. "There's so much I need to ask you." She smiled, her voice growing faint. "You'll figure it out, Ellie. You're stronger than you think. Just follow the rules." And then she was gone. The corner booth was empty again, the faint smell of chamomile lingering in the air. I sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of her words pressing down on me. The cafe wasn't just a business. It was a responsibility, a lifeline for the lost. And now, it was my burden to bear. I didn't know if I could do it. But as I stood and began to tidy up, I realized I didn't have a choice. The lanterns outside needed lighting, and the next cup of tea wasn't going to brew itself.